Um, One of the things that a number of you have remarked on, which I think is just absolutely terrific, I don't think Stanford or FSG could have ever anticipated this even, is just the power of the framing to the work that you do. I mean, I've heard a number of people say, you know, gee, you've given a language and you've given a structure and a name to a lot of what we're doing. And that in and of itself helps us. But it also allows us to talk in a common way, just as we're talking about within collective impact initiatives, whether we're talking early childhood nonprofits, for them to get together and to have a common language around the data. Can we, as we increase our social learning about how we do this, can we have a common language around collective impact so that we can learn from one initiative that may look very different than the issue area that we work in, and learn from another? So we intentionally figured that we would try to sort of stretch the bounds of places that we're seeing collective impact happen. And so in our second Stories from the Field session, we are going to transport you from Cincinnati in northern Kentucky to the Ivory Coast. Now, in introducing our next speaker, I want to say several years ago, FSG was contacted by the Mars Corporation, the makers of M&Ms and Snickers and Dove cream bars. And when we showed up at the Mars headquarters, we were greeted by a very unusual individual who we subsequently learned had, quite an extraordinary background. And among the things that he has done includes being jailed in Mississippi in the 60s for participating in the civil rights activism. Woohoo! I don't know how much of you will clap for this, but competing on vintage motorcycles for the land speed record on the Bonneville Salt Flats. Founding a very successful organic foods company called Seeds of Change, which he subsequently sold to Mars. And finally, and also partnering with IBM to sequence the cocoa plant genome in order to produce healthier, more disease-resistant cocoa plants. And finally, bearing an uncanny resemblance to a member of that former all-time great 80s band, ZZ Top. Now, when we met with this individual, he had an unusual twofold request. The first, he said, was to help us convince senior management of Mars that improving the lives of poor cocoa farmers in Cote d'Ivoire is a mission-critical, is a business-essential issue. And the second is help us think about how we make this a collective approach. We know it can't be just Mars alone. We know we need to engage the Cote d'Ivoirian government. We know we need to engage the World Bank. We know we need to engage bilateral agencies. We're walking up to the fact that we might even need to engage our competitors and even some of our suppliers in thinking about how we transform the lives of poor cocoa farmers in Cote d'Ivoire. And this individual said to us, I know I can't do it alone, but I don't know how to do it. Now, we didn't bother telling him at the time that we didn't know how to do it either. And after 2.5 years of working with this individual, I am glad he never asked. Howard Shapiro is Global Staff Officer for Plant Science and External Research at Mars Incorporated. For more than 35 years, Howard has worked with sustainable agriculture and agroforestry systems, plant genetics, and food production systems in Europe, Asia, Africa, Mesoamerica, South America, and the United States. In 2008, Howard was named a fellow with the World Agroforestry Center. He is also an adjunct professor at UC Davis. And Howard is also one of the most brilliant minds and most passionate agents for change that I know. So welcome to the stage, Mr. Howard Shapiro.
So those of you who are in academia will know that the word adjunct was misspelled on that last slide. That's about the only joke I know. 2008, we started working with FSG, and it's really true. I mean, we're a pretty big corporation, third largest food company in the world. We have a major food business, we have a major pet care business, we have a major drinks business, we have a sort of a incubator business. It's broad-based, 122 countries we have manufacturing in, so it's worldwide. We're the leaders in the categories we exist in. But what we weren't the leaders in was really understanding the complexity of the situation we were facing. And Mars Incorporated is a chocolate company at heart and soul. When you think of Mars, you think of chocolate in many, many ways before you recognize all the other divisions or segments that we have, which are really quite extraordinary and deliver both pet care nutrition and human nutrition around the world on a daily basis to millions and millions of people. But the key was that there's about 4.5 million cocoa farmers in the world that live in poverty. And we are a privately held company. We're highly profitable. And we had a responsibility to understand the complexity of the situation in order to drive home what we considered to be mutuality. A word oftentimes overused, and people abuse it, but we understand mutuality internally to be a very critical principle of how we operate ourselves as a business. And the last principle at Mars is freedom. And what freedom means is if you don't have enough money to support your family, you're not going to make those decisions or those changes that the outside pressure might suggest you would be a better choice, because you're living day to day, you're living hand to hand, whatever all those metaphors are. It's really quite catastrophic. And I'll go through the process. So in 2008, we engaged with John and Justin Bakule and Sonia Pashke, who's here, and Mark Fitzer. Basically, that became our core group that we engaged with, and we caused hell for each other from the very first day we began, because they didn't understand biological systems, and we didn't understand social systems. And they're really quite different. And you got to throw in ecological systems and environmental systems, and you got to throw in cultural systems. We're talking about a part of the world, Cote d'Ivoire, which produces 34% of all the cacao in the world that makes chocolate for us and our competitors. And 70% of the cacao in the world is all grown in West Africa. So whatever happens in Cote d'Ivoire happens in Ghana, happens in Nigeria, happens in Cameroon. It's like having all your eggs in one basket. But again, how do you manage this? So I'll read from a few things and tell you about some other things, but the question for me, and when I say me, I mean Mars Incorporated because I represent that company. I also mean a team. And I think one of the things they talked about earlier about build credibility, it's not just my credibility, it's all the people who work on this process, on this project, who are spread around the world. I mean, we're global, so the people who work on this are spread from South America to East Asia to all across Africa and many other places. But Richard Feynman wrote in a report on the Challenger disaster. As years went by, NASA officials got used to living with small failures. If the faulty O-rings didn't produce a catastrophe last time, they probably won't this time. They figured that. And he compared this, Feynman, to playing Russian roulette. Success in the last round is not a good predictor of success this time around. Nonetheless, as things seemed to be going well, people unconsciously adjusted their definition of acceptable risk. So when I started talking with FSG, when I started talking with the World Bank and the governments of West Africa, and this is not my specialty, believe me, I deal on molecular level, I'm a molecular biologist, plant geneticist. When we started having these conversations, I realized that there was no acceptable risk. Because if you say the word acceptable risk, you're basically saying people who live on 450 kilos of cacao sold into the global marketplace is okay. And that's way below the Millennium Development Goals and what they're supposed to be. So in 2008, we did a few things that we thought would be helpful towards driving this, and then in 2009 and 2010 and in 2011, even with the complications in Cote d'Ivoire, we're doing that. So in 2008, I made the announcement that we were going to sequence the cocoa genome with IBM and USDA. We didn't think it was going to be that big a story. It ran in 900 newspaper. 55 million people read the story. But the real story was that we were going to put it in the public domain and not own it. We would not own the cocoa genome, even though we paid for it, because it was more valuable pre-competitive. It was more valuable shared. The collective impact of that action was much more profound if we gave it away. 18,000 people from 122 countries have utilized it since we published it on September 15th, 2010, in the public domain. It cannot be patented. I can't own it. Our competitors can't own it. So it was collective impact. The second thing we did, and John was there at this meeting in 2008 in the fall, we held what was called the Kumasi Consensus, because no one in West Africa, which is 70% of the world's cocoa production, had ever sat down and thought, maybe we ought to talk about the problems. They were basically looking at a challenge or disaster every day of the week. In 2009, we did something else audacious. We determined that the only way to change the game was to state publicly that in 2020, every cocoa bean that Mars bought would be certified organic, not organic, I wish that was true, certified sustainable. Every one. And we're the largest user of the 3 million plus metric tons that are grown. And I know how much we use, but we're private, so I won't quite tell you, but there was only 4,000 tons available in 2009, and we're the world's largest user, so it was a long stretch. But if you don't stand on principle, if you don't try to build a collective action, uncommon collaboration, what do you end up with? You end up with just the stasis, and you stay where you are. And I talked to actually a statistician who was at Cornell at that time, because having convinced the business this was a good thing to do, I sort of had the cold palms panic. I wonder if it doesn't happen, what really goes on, and what does it take to cause the tipping point? The chap is now here at Stanford, and he said 31, 35, 37% of the industry will tip. The entire industry to 100% certified, sustainably grown. And then who would want to have on their package the phrase unsustainably grown with the skull and crossbone? That's collective impact. It happens at different levels. But the certification wasn't enough by itself. We determined with FSG this little funny thing that I called Certification Plus. Because certification deals a lot with social issues, and cultural issues, environmental issues, and ecological issues, but no certification had ever dealt with economic issues. And so we determined, as I'll run through some slides now, exactly what had to happen. Oh, here it is. We must do more with less, and then more again with less. And why is that? Because we're running out of biological capital. We're running out of all kinds of capital, but we're running out of biological capital. There was a famous American who said one time, Will Rogers is his name, they're growing more people every day, but they're not growing any more dirt. It's a finite amount of biological capital we have. And this is what the Mata Atlantica rainforest in Brazil looked like, the second most profound producer of cacao. This is 45, this is 60, this is 73, and this is 1990. And every forest in the world is under similar pressure. And we can grow more cocoa because we need another Cote d'Ivoire by 2020, but we'll cut down every forest that can be cut down in the neotropics. So that wasn't an answer. It's inefficient farming at the expense of the forest. You cannot live on 450 kilos. We determined that it was not possible. To accept this is to accept poverty for people that are your partners. How many of you want to talk about your collective impact partners in Cincinnati and say, it's okay for them to be in poverty because I'm doing fine? You can't accept that. It's a status that doesn't work. So if you get 400 kilos, it takes 2 million metric tons to get it, which is about what we're growing there now. It takes 5 million hectares. But if you get 500 kilos, it takes 4 million hectares. And if you get 666 kilos, it takes 3,000 hectares. And if you get 1,000 kilos, it takes 2 million hectares. And if you get 2,000 kilos, which is achievable and easily done, if you go through all the steps that were talked about earlier today and how you make a project and how you put all the pieces together, cultural, social, environmental, ecological, and economic, you can get down to 1 million hectares, and look at all that picture that's left for doing other things like protecting the forest and growing food. And in the area where we're working, what is the second most thing that goes along with economic poverty? It's chronic hunger and malnutrition. And if you ever see stunting, if you understand what stunting is, which is the incomplete development of a human being because of malnutrition, changes your life forever. So this is what we did. There's a whole sector. Mars is going to do a certain number of things. There's a high productivity sector. There's certified purchasing. And you start to look at common agendas, agricultural extension, input and credit provision, certification, plant material distribution, because we need better trees. You get to cocoa market information systems. This is collective impact. We didn't call it that then, or John didn't tell us that's what it was called, because he hadn't published yet. He probably didn't want us to jump ahead of him and start using it at the World Bank and stuff. I'm not sure we knew it was that. But this brought to me a very important metaphor, and that metaphor was called what it would be like to cut down the last tree on Easter Island. Do you ever think about that? Some person took an axe and cut down the very last tree, either to make a boat and escape or to cook something and realize he was stuck. But the last tree is really a metaphor for the destruction of Easter Island, but more generally a comment on human frailty. First, the failure to perceive threat and make plans and execute. Second, how the insulated decision maker with a conflict between short and long term embraces neither choice. I'll just cut the tree down. And third, and the most important thing when you talk about, I think, what we now call collective impact, is it's hard to make decisions in changing circumstances. You think you're going to go this way? It's just not going to work that way. I like that little straight line that Jeff showed early on, but I can tell you when you're in the field in a natural system, there are no straight lines. And nothing ever goes to sleep in the tropics. It may go to sleep at night in Cincinnati, I don't really think so. But things are always moving, and you can't control that. It's too critical. So goals can be supported through sourcing practice or sector level action. So you see, we have economic goals, we have environmental goals, and we have social goals. I couldn't convince them to write the word cultural or ecological, because people are having trouble separating that out, because people always want to say economic, social, environmental. But environmental is not ecological, and social is not cultural. So in our effort, the collective impact had to deal with all 5 of those and not a single thing less. But the impact has to be visual, it has to be tactical, it has to be measurable. You must be able to say that there is an impact on volume-based gains. So currently, 450 kilos per hectare of land. With a little bit of fertilizer, you get 135 kilos. With improved current generation, with distribution, planting material, what I mean by that is a new tree. You get 585 kilos more, and with fertilizer you get 400 plus. You're at 1,500 kilos. You've tripled the income of someone, and you have not crashed the market, because we need another Cote d'Ivoire in 10 years. So economics will drive it. Someplace economics drives it. You're not going to pay for school fees if you have no money for food. There are things that are a trickle-down effect. So for this particular collective impact, we have to change the economic model. Doesn't mean that we're not paying attention to social, cultural, environmental, ecological issues. We are. We're protecting forests. We're reducing illogical use of fertilizers. We're trying to change the worst form of child experience to the best form of child experience, so every kid goes to school. But it will not happen unless this collective impact. Here's another collective impact. Current yields, knowledge, germplasm, and fertilizer is collective impact. Then we decided that we couldn't do it unless we had partners. Very important thing. Most work like this goes underneath the radar. They don't engage the government. You have NGO mania everywhere in the developing world. Most of them never relate to the government. We decided with FSG that we would write a memorandum of understanding. Now, normally most corporations don't write memorandums of understandings with countries. I can assure you that when our legal department found out about this, there was a catastrophic gasp for fresh air. But we found a champion. Somebody talked about who's the lead. Grant Reed, the president of the chocolate segment. We found a minister of agriculture, Minister Sangafoa. It was a new paradigm to actually do this. But as we were walking out of the room, I kept thinking, I need the competitors, I need the grinders, I need everyone in the cocoa sector to join the same way when we started certification. When we started certification, we appealed to the Dutch government to get behind it. The Dutch government, which is very active, called the world's biggest processor, called Barry Callebaut, and said, you will join this. And they called Nestle and said, you will join this. And they called Kraft, and you will join this. Collective impact. This is what we promised, pretty straightforward. We're going to collaborate and we're going to monitor. M&E, monitoring and evaluation. If you don't have a baseline, you can lie about anything. I love that line earlier. I mean, I'm going to use that on my team very quickly. Too much data, Howard. We have too much data. You can't have enough data. You can manipulate data, you can falsify data, but at the end of the day, if you don't know where you started, you have no way to measure where you've gone. Two very specific things. This is pre-competitive. Much of everything that you all are talking about is pre-competitive. Educating every school kid in Cincinnati is pre-competitive. What's wrong with pre-competitive? I don't buy any of the cocoa beans directly in Cote d'Ivoire. All our competitors have the same ability to buy it. What I do have, and what is happening is, I have a sustainable supply. And if I share that sustainable supply, everybody takes it, and then I tip this piece over, which is so critical for the impact of certification. A couple more quick points, because I know I have to answer some questions. I love Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I spent a lot of time in our corporate headquarters in Washington, D.C., but I live about as far away in America as you can. I live at Davis, California, where I teach at UC. But if you're ever in Washington, D.C., the most impactful memorial next to the Lincoln Memorial, and Lincoln is great, because when you look up and you see this guy, you really get it, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And if you want to talk about collective impact, you walk into the memorial and you start to see all this going on, and there's a long wall with a list that's about 4 feet high, with little bitty writing about this big, about all the things that were started during his term as president. That was all about collective impact from all kinds of areas. So the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have too much, it's whether we provide enough for those who have too little. Economic, social, cultural, environmental, and ecological. The key question is, are you really committed to build a diverse collaboration to create a really sustainable future? Every day when you wake up, are you really ready to do it? Are you going to ring the bell every day you go to see your associates that you work with, the people, your extension of your network? And if you're willing to embrace multiple solutions to the problems we face, then you can say, I'm probably pretty interested in collective impact. But if you can't, you need to really reorient yourself and pull the game again in a different way. So I'm happy to answer some questions. That's about 15 minutes, I think.
Good morning. This was fascinating. Thank you for sharing your insights. I had a question for you, because when I think of cacao in Cote d'Ivoire, West Africa, there are two sort of broad lenses through which I see the issue, and I'm not an expert by any means. And I'm curious as to whether Mars or FSG took these issues into account. The first is really the history and legacy of colonialism in the region, which emphasized the development of cash crops and the overdependence on specific crops like cocoa or groundnuts in particular countries, and how that is impacting the current agricultural situation in those countries. And secondly, a gender lens, because what ended up happening was that men were encouraged to grow cash crops, and women grew crops for consumption, which has further exacerbated gender disparities. So did you have a gender lens? Did you look at the history of cash crops and cacao in the region? And how did you attempt then to mitigate those disparities? And more broadly, do collective impact approaches really need to have those lenses in place, because otherwise you may bring players to the table who have more access, more resources, come from more privileged communities than those that perhaps are more directly affected by the problem you're trying to address?
Great question. Those of you who know Africa know that the cultures began on the coast and went to the desert in West Africa. And at every sort of change, there was a different culture. They were not divided the way they are now. The Europeans divided the countries this way, just drew lines along rivers, not understanding that the people on the coast really only traded slightly inland, and the people at the edge of the forest only traded slightly inland, and the people of the forest traded down and up to the Sahel, and at the Sahel they traded to the desert people who were nomadic tribesmen. So when you take a country and all of a sudden reorient it this way and put people together who had not really been a nation together because they'd had horizontal immigration across their boundaries of agriculture, it makes it very difficult. So we did think about that. And I remember, someone came with us from FSG. We went to see the alternate government in Ghana is based on a tribal tradition, but he's equally powerful. So we did consider the history of colonialism and cropping systems. And it is true that cash crops, the first cash crops exported were timber. If you look at all the beautiful French veneers from the turn of the century up to the 30s and 40s, it all came from deforestation. What we also looked at was malnutrition in food production systems. You can eat a lot of calories. I mean, if you all love starch, this is the place to go to. You can have cassava, and you can have plantains, and you can have starch foods. And I'll get back to that if you'll just hold that thought. So we looked at what nutrition was. The gender lens is all of our training is men and women together. There's no separate training for women, and there's no separate training for men. And the head of the Comité de Gestion du Cacao et Café is a woman. So even in the government, we were working with keystone women who were also cocoa farmers, so we were able to transfer back the issues that she saw as well as encapsulate the issues that we saw. So I think that we were largely, our lens was focused on men and women cocoa farmers and giving them both the same thing. Now on food, we've just organized, and it'll be announced in September at the Clinton Global Initiative, a grand coalition to take the 15 to 20 food crops that are underutilized because of nutritive value, go through the same kind of lens we did the cocoa genome, sequence them, assemble them and annotate them, and build a breeding program across Africa with 40 trained new scientists with what's called NEPAD, which is the extension arm of activism of the African Union. So we're taking food on simultaneously. That was the shocking part for me, was the quality of the nutritive value of what they eat. I don't know if that answered your question, but hopefully in some roundabout manner, and I'm not going to run away, so I'll be here the rest of the day to answer it. Sure.
I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about the role of leadership, how in the collective impact model, leadership drives the overall agenda?
Yeah, I would say in the early days, as Jeff was talking about, you need some hard-headed people who will just basically not take no for an answer. And I was the hardest-headed in Mars. And you need champions at all levels, internal and external. We needed Daniel Sellon, who's the chief economist at the World Bank, to look at us and say, you do this You prove the metrics, we got the cash to roll out the door. I mean, they're talking about $100 million over 10 years from maybe 2014 to 2024 to improve the sector. We talked to the government. We never saw the past president. We saw the finance minister, and we saw the ag minister, and we saw the environmental minister and the minister of research. We also went to extension. We also went to the communities. You got to build it all the way. But every now and then you'll find someone who is really a key figure, and you really go, thank God we got Sangafoa, who was the Minister of Agriculture, who helped push this through. So you need to have some unique figures within the structure. We had Madame Donwai, who basically got it because her family were cocoa farmers. And she saw that we didn't have anything in the game for Mars except to change the lives of somewhere around 900,000 farmers over the next 10 years and to change their lives on multiple levels. But it does take some leaders. Grant Reed, the president of the chocolate segment at Mars, he finally got it one day. We want to be in business in chocolate in 50 years. Either we're going to fix the problem, he said to me, or what's the alternative? And all I could think of was sawdust and artificial flavor. And he agreed. It's time to change. One more question?
I think we have to launch.
There you have it.
Thank you, Howard. I think it was just fascinating to go from an example in education in Cincinnati in the U.S. to an example of agriculture and sustainability and economic development in Africa. To that end, I just want to say one thing to Howard. While at FSG we are not experts in molecular biology, we do know what the human genome is. My name is Jeff Kutash. I'm a managing director with FSG. I'm based here in our San Francisco office, and I head up our education and youth practice. A couple things I just wanted to mention before I don't want to be the only thing standing between you and food, so I'm going to be very quick. First thing is you'll notice, we talked about education, we talked about agricultural sustainability. I've heard people talking about issues of poverty alleviation, how do you deal in rural communities. You will notice there are table tents around the room with various topic areas on them. Across a whole range of different topics. What we'd encourage you to do after lunch is to come back, and if there's a particular issue area that you're focused on or would like to speak with other folks about, to find one of those tables and continue the conversation at a more issue level. There's also a variety of tables that either have other on them or that have no table tent on them. If there's more interest than there are tables, feel free to grab some like-minded folks and make your own table as well. One other thing really important to mention, the entire conference is a green conference. We brought the rain in to make sure that it remains green everywhere. But in particular, you'll notice every single thing involved with lunch is compostable, and that includes the cups, that includes the forks, which look like they're plastic, but they are compostable. So we would just ask everyone, as you get rid of your lunch plates and food and glasses and forks, to put them in the compostable bins and not in the trash bin. When you walk outside the doors to the left, there'll be some of the doors open. You'll see the buffet lunch set up. There are 2 tables, and we encourage people to go on lines on both sides of that table so we get more people through more quickly, and the drinks are here inside. So having said that, we'd encourage you to go grab some lunch and then find your way back in here to have some of the table discussions. Thanks.